We picture polished steel and golden chalices, but the truth was forged in blood and freezing mud. How did a likely illiterate Dark Age warlord transformed into the epitome of high chivalry 600 years later? Welcome to Somnolent. We are stripping away the magic to find the man, and then rebuilding the myth to understand why he matters today. Join us as we look deep into the forgotten shadows of a lost British history.
To find that man, we must travel back to a moment of total collapse. The year is 410. For nearly 4 centuries, Britannia had been a corner of a global superpower. But the heart of Rome was failing, and the limbs were being pulled back to protect the core. A letter arrived from the Emperor Honorius. It didn't offer reinforcements or gold. Instead, it delivered a cold, final instruction: look to your own defenses. In that single moment, the world of paved roads, bathhouses, and literacy shattered. The legions marched toward the coast, their hobnailed boots echoing on stone ways they would never walk again. They left behind a population that had forgotten how to fight for itself, living in a province that was suddenly, terrifyingly alone. This was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing decay. Imagine a world where the money in your pocket becomes worthless overnight because there is no central government to back its value. Imagine the shops going empty because the trade ships from the Mediterranean have stopped coming. The great villas, once the height of luxury, with their heated floors and intricate mosaics, were abandoned to the damp and the cold. People moved into the ruins, huddling for warmth in corners of buildings they no longer knew how to repair. The grand cities of Londinium and Verulamium became ghost towns. This was a true apocalypse, not of fire, but of silence. The records stop. The literacy rates plummet. Britain enters a dark age where the only thing that matters is survival. As the Roman sun set, the wolves began to circle. To the east, across the gray waters of the North Sea, the horizon was filled with the square sails of longships. These were the Saxons, the Angles, and the Jutes. In the stories we tell today, we often see them as a single wave of invaders, but the reality was far more chaotic. They were opportunistic raiders at first, hitting coastal villages and vanishing back into the fog with silver and slaves. But soon, they realized there was no one left to stop them from staying. They weren't looking for a kingdom to rule. They were looking for land to farm, and they were willing to take it by force. The smoke of burning thatch became a permanent feature of the British skyline. Inside this fractured landscape, the local British elites were failing. Without a central army, the island splintered into dozens of tiny, bickering territories. Local strongmen tried to claim the mantle of Roman authority, but they lacked the steel to back it up. They were fighting 2 wars at once, one against the foreign invaders and another against their own neighbors for the dwindling resources of a dying province. It was a time of betrayal, of shifting loyalties, and of absolute desperation. The people didn't need a king in a golden crown sitting on a marble throne. They didn't need magic. They needed someone who could win a fight. This is the environment that demanded the figure we now call Arthur. But in this century, he wouldn't have been a king. He would have been a dux bellorum, a leader of battles. This was a specific Roman military title, a role for a man who could take the remaining cavalry, the last vestiges of Roman discipline, and move them quickly from one crisis to the next. He would have been a soldier of the mud and the shield wall, a man who spent his life on horseback, moving between desperate hill forts and muddy river crossings.
He was the product of a brutal necessity. The gap between this harsh, blood-stained reality and the Camelot of our imagination is vast.
There were no shining suits of plate armor. Those wouldn't exist for another 1,000 years. There were no towering stone castles with fluttering banners. There was only the cold wind, the smell of wet wool, and the constant threat of a blade in the dark. To understand the true story, we have to let go of the courtly love and the Holy Grail. We have to see Britain as it was, a wounded, bleeding land crying out for a protector. This was the forge in which the legend was hammered out, a place of iron and ash where a single man's ability to hold the line meant the difference between a culture surviving or being erased from the map forever. As the last lights of Roman civilization flickered out, a new kind of power was rising from the shadows of the old world. A power that relied not on bloodlines, but on the strength of a sword arm and the loyalty of a few desperate men. This is where the shadow begins to take a human shape.
To give that human shape a name, we have to look back to a time when Britain was a fractured mosaic of crumbling Roman villas and rising wooden hill forts. We begin in the middle of the 6th century with a man named Gildas, a monk writing a polemic titled On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain. Gildas was a contemporary of the era, living through the very decades when this savior was supposedly holding back the tide of invaders. He describes the absolute terror of the Saxon advance, the smell of wood smoke, and the desperate resistance of the British people. He gives us the first clear account of a massive victory at a place called Mount Badon, a battle that broke the Saxon momentum for a generation. Yet, within his furious, grieving pages, the name Arthur is nowhere to be found. Gildas attributes the British survival to a man named Ambrosius Aurelianus, a leader of Roman descent who rallied the local tribes. For the only writer who was actually there, or at least close enough to remember the survivors, the man we call Arthur does not exist. This silence is the first great wall that every historian hits. If a hero had truly saved a civilization, how could his name be forgotten by the very people he protected? It takes nearly 300 years for that silence to be broken. In the 9th century, a Welsh cleric named Nennius compiled a collection of documents known as the History of the Britons. It is here, in a dusty list of battles, that the name Arthur finally steps out of the darkness and into the written word. Nennius does not present him as a king wearing a crown. Instead, he uses a specific military term, dux bellorum, a leader of battles. He describes a soldier who fought alongside the various kings of the Britons, acting perhaps as a supreme commander or a wandering warlord for hire. Nennius provides a specific itinerary of 12 conflicts, a bloody map that stretches across the entire island. From the banks of the River Blaine to the heights of the City of Legions, we see a figure who seems to be everywhere at once. But the logistics are impossible. These battles took place in locations hundreds of miles apart, over a span of time that would require a single man to remain in his prime for decades. The climax of this list is the return to Badon Hill. Here, the account shifts from a military record into something closer to a fever dream. Nennius claims that in this single day of fighting, 960 men fell by Arthur's hand alone. It is a staggering superhuman statistic that defies the reality of ancient combat. We are told he carried the image of the Virgin Mary on his shoulders, a detail that suggests the Church was already beginning to claim his memory for their own purposes. This is the moment where the soldier begins to merge with the miraculous. The math suggests we are not looking at the deeds of one individual, but the combined victories of an entire era condensed into a single convenient name.
In this early stage of the story, Arthur is not a legend. He is an ambiguity. He is a placeholder for the collective resistance of a people who were being pushed to the very edge of the world. He might have been a Romanized Briton, using old imperial tactics to defeat tribal invaders. He might have been a composite figure, a name used to summarize the work of a dozen different forgotten generals. In the manuscripts of the 9th century, there is no round table, no sword in the stone, and no mystical castle. There is only the grit of the shield wall and the cold reality of a commander trying to hold back the inevitable collapse of his society. Before the gold and the velvet of the later stories, there is only a name scratched into vellum, a ghost in the margins of a history that was almost lost. This was the raw material of a hero, a human figure standing in the mud of a dark age, waiting for the poets to find him and turn his shadow into a king. But the mud of the 6th century could not hold him forever. For nearly 600 years, the memory of that nameless leader flickered like a dying ember in the remote hills of Wales and the rainy corners of Brittany. He was a secret kept by the conquered, a whisper of a time when the invaders were held at bay by a man who refused to break. But history is often written by those who seek to use it, and in the mid-12th century, the whisper finally became a roar. The catalyst for this transformation was a single book written by a man whose ambitions were as vast as the history he was about to invent. Geoffrey of Monmouth was a cleric and a scholar, but above all, he was perhaps the greatest literary opportunist the world has ever known. Around the year 1136, he produced his History of the Kings of Britain, and in doing so, he did not just transcribe the past, he terraformed it. He took those dry, fractured notes from the monks of old and injected them with the adrenaline of high drama and the dark glitter of the supernatural. This was the moment of ignition. Before Geoffrey, there was no Merlin as we know him today. There was only a madman in the woods or a boy with the gift of prophecy. Geoffrey took these scattered fragments of Celtic folklore and fused them into a single towering figure, the architect of destiny. He gave the legend its first true sense of wonder. Through Merlin, the mundane world of shield walls and sieges was breached by the impossible. We are introduced to the figure of Uther Pendragon, a king driven by a consuming, illicit passion for Igraine, the wife of his enemy. Geoffrey takes us to the jagged, salt-sprayed cliffs of Tintagel, where the waves crash against the ancient stone, and shows us a world where a king can wear another man's face through sorcery to father a child of prophecy. This was no longer a local chronicle of border skirmishes. This was the arrival of the epic. In this version of the story, Arthur is born from a union of blood, magic, and deception, a foundation that gave the character a weight and a mystery he had never possessed in the old Welsh poems. But Geoffrey's motives were not purely artistic. He lived in a Britain that had been shattered and remade by the Norman conquest. The new lords of the land, the descendants of William the Conqueror, found themselves in a strange and precarious position. They were masters of a territory with a deep, ancient history, yet they were essentially outsiders with no ancestral link to the soil they now ruled. They were also locked in a fierce cultural arms race with the French, whose legends of Charlemagne and his 12 peers provided a glorious unifying myth for the continent. The Normans needed a hero of their own, someone who could stand toe-to-toe with the ghosts of Rome and the champions of France. They needed a lineage that felt as old as the earth itself. Geoffrey provided exactly what they required. He framed Arthur not as a desperate resistance leader fighting a losing battle against the Saxons, but as a world conqueror. He depicted an Arthurian empire that stretched across Europe, humbling even the Roman Senate. By elevating the British past, Geoffrey gave his Norman patrons a sense of belonging and a claim to greatness. He turned a defeated culture's folk hero into a pan-European superstar, legitimizing a new dynasty by anchoring it to a golden age that had been polished to a brilliant shine. He took the provincial and made it universal, ensuring that the name of Arthur would never again be confined to the margins of a forgotten chronicle. The impact of this work was instantaneous and total. Within years, copies of Geoffrey's history were being traded across the English Channel, and the story began to mutate and grow in the hands of poets and courtly writers. The historical man, the one who stood in the mud and the cold, was being buried under layers of silk, stone, and sorcery. Geoffrey provided the skeleton of the legend, but more importantly, he provided the permission to dream. He moved Arthur out of the dusty archives of the clergy and into the vibrant courts of the nobility. The rough-hewn warlord was being refined, his iron sword replaced by a blade of mystic origin, his humble followers transformed into a fellowship of knights. We are witnessing the precise moment where history ends and the literary juggernaut begins. The shadow was no longer just a memory of the past, it had become a blueprint for the future. As the 12th century progressed, the simple question of whether Arthur lived became secondary to the spectacular reality of what he had become. The raw material had been found, the magic had been added, and the stage was now set for the invention of the Round Table and the quest for something even more elusive than a kingdom. But the stories did not remain trapped on the wind-swept shores of Britain. They traveled south, crossing the narrow seas into the heart of continental Europe. Here, in the vibrant courts of 12th century France, the Arthurian legend underwent its most radical surgery. The man responsible was a poet named Chrétien de Troyes. He took the sketches provided by earlier historians and painted them in the vivid colors of the medieval high life. He was not interested in the tactical movements of a tribal leader or the dry logistics of border defense. Instead, he looked at Arthur and saw a vessel for a new kind of storytelling, one that prioritized the internal life of the knight over the survival of the tribe. This was the birth of the romance. In the hands of the French, the muddy battlefields of the post-Roman wilderness were replaced by the polished marble floors of Champagne and Flanders. The air no longer smelled of wet earth and rusted iron. It smelled of expensive incense, heavy silks, and the perfumed atmosphere of the royal court. Arthur himself began to change. He was no longer the primary actor, the one swinging the sword at the front of the line. He became a more stationary figure, a manager of greatness, the sun around which a galaxy of more interesting stars began to orbit. The most significant of these new arrivals was Lancelot du Lac. Before the late 1100s, Lancelot did not exist in the records. He was a pure invention of the French imagination, designed to embody the perfect contradiction of the medieval hero. He was the greatest warrior in the world, yet he was utterly helpless in the face of his own heart. By introducing Lancelot, Chrétien de Troyes injected a dose of human frailty into the myth. He created a psychological drama that would resonate for 1,000 years. The affair between Lancelot and Queen Guinevere was not merely a scandalous plot point. It was a subversion of the entire feudal system. It suggested that there were forces, individual desire, passion, and personal longing that were more powerful than the oaths sworn to a crown or the structures of the church. This shift mirrored a change in the audience. The The stories were no longer being told to warriors around a fire to prepare them for battle. They were being read by refined aristocrats, often women like Marie de Champagne or Eleanor of Aquitaine, who held significant cultural power. These patrons wanted stories of courtly love and complex moral dilemmas. They wanted to see the tension between duty and emotion. Under their influence, the Celtic warrior was domesticated. He was taught to dance, to speak with eloquence, and to adhere to a strict code of chivalry that had more to do with social conduct than military prowess. As the narrative became more sophisticated, it also became more mystical. This period saw the introduction of the Holy Grail. In the older Welsh myths, there had been mentions of magical cauldrons that could restore the dead or provide endless food, relics of a pagan past. Chrétien took these earthy ancient objects and began to scrub away their origins. He introduced a mysterious vessel, which later writers would firmly identify as the cup used at the Last Supper. This move shifted the focus of the Round Table from the physical world to a spiritual one. The knights were no longer just defending borders, they were on a quest for divine grace. The wilderness they rode through became a symbolic landscape where every encounter with a black knight or a hidden castle was a test of their internal purity. This transformation was a masterclass in cultural appropriation. The French poets took a local hero of a defeated people and turned him into a pan-European superstar. By stripping away the specific, grimy details of 6th century Britain, they made the story universal. It didn't matter if you were in a castle in Germany, a palace in Italy, or a manor in England. The themes of the Round Table spoke to the aspirations of the entire medieval ruling class. Arthur became the gold standard for what a king should be, and his knights became the models for how a gentleman should behave. The Arthurian legend became the first true bestseller of the Western world. Manuscripts were copied and shared across borders, translated and adapted, each new author adding their own layers of complexity. The stories were no longer property of the Welsh, they belonged to the world. But in this process of refinement and romanticization, something was lost. The raw, desperate energy of the original Celtic leader had been buried under layers of velvet and gold. The myth had become a mirror for the medieval elite, reflecting their own values back at them. Yet even as Arthur became a symbol of French courtly ideals, the dark, tragic end of the story remained. The seeds of the kingdom's destruction were now planted, not by invading armies, but by the very passions and secrets that had made these new stories so irresistible. The stage was set for the final act, where the perfection of the Round Table would collide with the reality of human nature. The perfection of the Round Table was never destined to last, because the men who sat around it were made of flesh and blood, prone to the same failings as those they sought to protect. This fundamental conflict between the ideal and the actual found its most powerful voice during one of the darkest chapters of English history. As the 15th century progressed, the country was consumed by a series of dynastic power struggles known as the Wars of the Roses. It was a time of shifting allegiances, where the old codes of honor were being discarded in favor of cold political survival. Families were divided, and the crown changed hands not through divine right, but through the brutal arithmetic of the battlefield. It was against this backdrop of civil collapse that the scattered fragments of the Arthurian legend were finally gathered into a single definitive narrative. The man responsible for this monumental task was Sir Thomas Malory. His life was a stark contrast to the noble knights he depicted. Malory was a knight himself, But he was also a man who spent years behind the bars of Newgate Prison, accused of crimes that suggest a life of turbulence and violence. It is one of the great ironies of literature that the most graceful and enduring vision of chivalry was composed by a prisoner living in a world of political chaos. From his cell, Mallory looked back at the sprawling French and English sources of the previous centuries and saw a way to make sense of the mess. He began to edit, translate, and reorder the stories, stripping away the endless subplots of the older romances to focus on the central tragedy of the king and his dream. The result was Le Morte d'Arthur, a work that transformed a collection of folk tales into a structured biography. Mallory provided the standard narrative that remains the foundation for almost every modern adaptation. He began with the mystery of Arthur's birth and the iconic moment of the sword in the stone. By making the young Arthur's rise a matter of divine intervention, Mallory offered a sense of legitimacy and order that was sorely lacking in his own time. He presented the early years of the reign as a period of unification where a young leader could bring peace to a fractured land. The establishment of the Round Table became the centerpiece of this effort. In Mallory's hands, the table was more than just a gathering place. It was a symbol of a new way of living, where strength was governed by law, and the king was the first among equals. But Mallory also understood that the higher a society climbs, the further it has to fall. He meticulously laid the groundwork for the eventual betrayal, positioning the love between Lancelot and Guinevere not just as a personal failing, but as a systemic flaw. Lancelot was the best of the best, the embodiment of every knightly virtue, yet his heart belonged to the one woman he could never have. This tension created a hairline fracture in the foundation of Camelot. Mallory depicted a world where the very excellence of the knights became their undoing. Their loyalty to one another was so fierce that when scandal finally broke, it forced everyone to take sides, tearing the fellowship apart from within. This was the reality that mirrored the world outside Mallory's prison window. He wrote about the death of a golden age, while his own society was witnessing the end of the medieval era. The final chapters of his work are steeped in a profound sense of loss. He describes the rise of Mordred, the king's illegitimate son, who represents the darker side of Arthur's past coming back to claim the present. The inevitable conclusion was the Battle of Camlan, a scene of total devastation, where the ideals of the Round Table were buried in the mud alongside the men who had once championed them. The image of the wounded king being carried away to the Isle of Avalon provided a haunting, ambiguous end to the story. By consolidating these stories into one cohesive arc, Mallory gave the English-speaking world a national epic. He took the disparate threads of 3 centuries of storytelling and tied them into a knot that has never been undone. Before Mallory, Arthur was a figure of shifting history and localized myth. After Mallory, he became the tragic hero of a unified narrative, a figure who represented the eternal hope for a better world and the inevitable disappointment of human nature. This version of the story survived the transition into the age of printing and the end of the feudal system, ensuring that the legend of Arthur would not be lost to time, but would instead become a permanent fixture of the human imagination. The story of the once and future king was no longer just a series of poems. It was a complete, tragic history of a dream that was almost realized. But dreams, however vivid, eventually demand the weight of proof. To find the man behind the shadow, we must leave the candlelit libraries and step into the wind-scoured ruins of the British coast. We are searching for a bridge between the ink of the monks and the grit of the earth, looking for the physical friction that occurs when legend meets the archaeological record. If Arthur existed, he did not live in a vacuum of myth. He lived in a world of timber, stone, trade, and blood. Tintagel is the first port of call, a place where geography seems to collaborate with the supernatural. Perched on the jagged, salt-sprayed cliffs of Cornwall, the medieval castle ruins dominate the skyline, but they are a chronological distraction. These stone walls were built by Richard, Earl of Cornwall, in the 13th century, centuries after the time of the historical Arthur. However, beneath these medieval layers lies an earlier, far more significant settlement. In 1998, a team of archaeologists working on the eastern terrace of the island unearthed a piece of slate that sent a jolt through the historical community. It bore a Latin inscription, Pater Coli Avi Ficit Artognu. Roughly translated, it tells of a man named Artognu, a descendant of Cole, who built or commissioned something here. While Artognu is not linguistically identical to Arthur, the connection is tantalizing. It proves that a high-status individual with a Brythonic name was active at Tintagel during the exact period the legends describe. But the Artognu stone is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The excavations at Tintagel revealed a startling reality about 6th century Britain. Researchers found more Mediterranean pottery from this period at Tintagel than in the rest of the British Isles combined. Thousands of shards of Phocaean red slipware and amphorae that once held olive oil and wine from the Eastern Empire tell a story of a thriving elite trade hub. This wasn't a site of rural poverty or post-Roman collapse. It was a seat of power, a fortress of the Dumnonian kings who remained connected to the wider Roman world long after the legions had departed. This archaeological reality provides the necessary infrastructure for the legend. It gives us a place where a high king could indeed have been conceived or born in a setting of continental luxury and maritime strength. Moving inland to the rolling greenery of Somerset, we find Cadbury Castle. To the casual observer, it is merely a steep terraced hill, but to the military historian, it is a fortification of immense strategic value. In the 1960s, Leslie Alcock led an extensive excavation that stripped back the soil to reveal a massive defensive project undertaken in the late 5th century. The Iron Age ramparts had been refortified with a complex timber and stone breastwork, and a great hall 60 feet long had been constructed at the summit. The sheer scale of the labor required to build such a structure suggests a leader with the authority to command thousands of workers and soldiers. This was not the work of a local chieftain defending a single valley. It was a regional nerve center. Local tradition has called this site Camelot for centuries, and while that specific name is a later literary invention, the site itself represents the exact type of military headquarters a commander like Arthur would have required to hold the line against the Saxon advance. To understand how such a commander functioned, we have to analyze the logistics of 6th century warfare. The geography of Britain at the time was a fractured landscape of Roman ruins, encroaching forests, and treacherous marshlands. If a figure like Arthur existed, he would have functioned as a mobile warlord rather than a sedentary monarch. The legends frequently highlight Arthur's cavalry, a heavy strike force that moved with a fluidity the infantry-based Germanic invaders could not match. When we map the traditional sites of Arthur's 12 battles, such as the River Glyne or the City of the Legions, they often align with key junctions of the decaying Roman road network. These roads remained the arteries of the island, and a commander who could master them could move forces from the southwest to the northern borders with incredible speed. Consider the tactical significance of the Somerset levels. In the 6th century, these were vast, impenetrable wetlands. A fortress like Cadbury sat on the edge of this natural barrier, acting as a gatekeeper. From this vantage point, a mobile force could strike east toward the Thames Valley or north toward the Severn, intercepting Saxon raiding parties before they could consolidate their gains. This is where the archaeology and the military reality begin to merge. We see a spike in the refortification of hill forts across the West Country during this period, creating a defensive screen that matches the historical pause in the Saxon expansion. The logistical evidence points toward a specific type of warfare, one of rapid response and high-stakes containment. The archaeology doesn't give us a face or a crown, but it gives us a context. It shows us a Britain that was not merely a dying province, but a resilient and organized territory fighting for its survival. We find evidence of a society that still valued the Roman military tradition, perhaps even fielding cataphracts, armored cavalry, that would eventually be transformed by the poets into the Knights of the Round Table. When we look at the physical evidence, the mythic fog begins to thin. We find a world where powerful men like Artognu traded with Constantinople, and where massive hill forts were raised to guard the remnants of a civilization. The gap between the once and future king and the gritty reality of a 6th century warlord is wide, but the archaeology proves that the stage for the legend was real. We are no longer looking at ghosts, we are looking at the footprint of a resistance that held the darkness at bay for a generation. The stones of Tintagel and the ramparts of Cadbury serve as silent witnesses to a history that was almost lost, providing the heavy, tangible foundation upon which the entire Arthurian edifice was built. This was a world of high stakes and hard borders, where the dream of a unified Britain was defended not with magic, but with spear, shield, and a sophisticated understanding of the land itself. When we move beyond the strategic landscape and the fortified hills, we encounter the most enduring mystery of the British Isles, the man behind the mask. If Britain was defended by flesh and blood rather than spells and enchantments, whose hands held those spears? Whose voice commanded the shield wall? Historians have spent centuries scouring the meager records of the 5th and 6th centuries, looking for a single figure who matches the legend. What they find is not one man, but a handful of shadows, each carrying a piece of the Arthurian puzzle. The search begins with the most documented candidate of them all, a man who actually appears in the writings of a near contemporary. The monk Gildas, writing just a few decades after the events, gives us the name Ambrosius Aurelianus. He describes him as a man of Roman lineage, perhaps the last of the provincial aristocrats who stayed behind when the legions left. Ambrosius emerged during a period of absolute chaos, a time when the Saxon invaders were pushing deeper into the heart of Britain. He wasn't a mythical king from a storybook. He was a gritty, practical military leader who organized the scattered British resistance. Gildas credits Ambrosius with a major turning point, a series of victories that culminated in the massive battle at Baden Hill. This victory supposedly halted the Saxon advance for a generation. If Arthur's primary historical role was the savior of Britain at Baden, then Ambrosius Aurelianus fits the profile better than anyone else. He represents the Roman side of the Arthurian coin, the disciplined commander using old imperial tactics to hold back the tide of barbarian expansion. Yet, as we look closer, the details start to shift. While Ambrosius has the military record, he lacks the name and some of the more specific biographical markers we associate with Arthur. For those, we must look across the English Channel to a figure known as Riothamus. In the late 5th century, a leader with this name led an army of 12,000 Britons into Gaul to assist the Roman emperor against the Visigoths. This figure was influential enough to be contacted by the Roman authorities as an equal. He fought battles in the very regions where later French poets would place the adventures of King Arthur. Most intriguingly, after a defeat near the town of Deols, Riothamus retreated toward a territory known as Avalon. He disappears from the historical record shortly thereafter. The parallels are striking. A high king of the Britons fighting on the continent linked to the name Avalon and eventually vanishing into the mists of history. If the later legends of Arthur's campaigns in Europe have a grain of truth, they likely began with the exploits of Riothamus. But the name Arthur itself remains the biggest hurdle. Neither Ambrosius nor Riothamus carried it. For a linguistic match, we turn our gaze to the north and the rugged terrain of Wales and the Midlands. Here we find Owain Dantgwyn, a warlord of the kingdom of Powys. Owain lived at the right time and moved in the right circles, but his connection to the legend is hidden in a nickname. It was common for Celtic warriors to adopt animal epithets to signify their strength and ferocity. Some scholars argue that the bear became the primary way people referred to this specific leader, eventually evolving into the proper name, Arthur.
Owain's life was marked by the kind of internal dynastic struggles that define the later parts of the Arthurian cycle, including a fatal betrayal by a nephew, a figure who could easily be the historical precursor to Mordred. As we hold these three candidates up to the light, a complicated truth begins to emerge. Ambrosius gives us the Roman military success. Riodamus gives us the international stature and the connection to Avalon. Owain Dantgwyn gives us the name and the tragic internal conflict. It becomes increasingly clear that we are not looking for one man who has been forgotten, but rather several men who have been fused together. History in the Dark Ages was not written down in real time. It was sung, recited, and passed through generations of oral tradition. In this process, the sharp edges of individual lives tend to blur. Over decades of storytelling around winter fires, the great deeds of the Roman Briton commander, the high king who sailed to Gaul, and the local warlord known as the Bear began to merge. They became a single, superhuman figure who could represent the hopes and the identity of a people under siege. This is the ghost of Arthur, a composite character created by a culture that needed a hero to personify their resistance against the encroaching Saxons. He is a psychological necessity as much as a historical possibility. The Arthur we recognize today is a collective memory, a distillation of the best and worst traits of the 5th century leadership. He is the last Roman, the supreme king, and the Celtic bear all at once. By the time the first formal histories were written down in the 9th century, these separate threads had already been woven into a single cord. The real Arthur isn't hiding under a specific rock or in a specific grave. He exists in the space between these men, a figure born from the friction of a collapsing civilization trying to remember its own name. The truth is far more fascinating than a simple biography. It is the story of how a fractured society took the broken pieces of its history and polished them into a legend that could survive the coming darkness. Arthur is the shadow cast by an entire generation of warriors, a silhouette that grows larger the further we move away from the light of the events themselves. As we look at the ruins they left behind, we realize that the man matters less than the idea he came to represent, the dream of a Britain that stood unified, even if only for a fleeting moment. That unification was more than just a matter of borders and battle lines. It was a fusion of the seen and the unseen, a marriage between the physical defense of a territory and the ancient, spiritual pulse of the land itself. When we strip away the shining plate armor and the stone cathedrals added by later medieval storytellers,
we find a narrative that breathes with the damp, heavy air of the primordial forest. The magic defining Arthur's world is not merely a literary invention, it is a distorted reflection of a world that existed long before the first Christian cross was carved into British stone. To find the source of these myths, we must look toward the water. Consider the most iconic image in the entire cycle, an arm clad in white samite reaching from the surface of a still lake to offer a golden-hilted sword. To a modern audience, this is pure fantasy. To an Iron Age Celt, it was a recognized reality of religious life. Throughout the British Isles, from the silt of the River Thames to the peat bogs of Llyn Serig Bach, archaeology has recovered hundreds of high-status weapons from the muck. These were not lost in battle or dropped by accident. They were often bent or broken, ritually killed, and cast into the depths as votive offerings to deities believed to inhabit the dark, cold spaces beneath the waves. The sword Excalibur is the ultimate votive offering. It does not belong to Arthur by right of manufacture or human inheritance. It is a loan from the spirits of the earth. In the earliest layers of the story, the sword is not pulled from a stone in a churchyard, but received from the water. When the dying king orders his knight to cast the blade back into the lake at the end of his life, he is not merely disposing of a weapon. He is performing a final pagan rite, returning the power of the land to the gods who granted it. The Lady of the Lake herself is no mere fairy. She is a survival of a water goddess, a figure akin to Coventina or Sulis, whose sacred springs were centers of healing and prophecy. The monks who eventually recorded these tales could not erase her, so they transformed her into a lady of mystery, yet her presence reveals a truth the medieval church tried to hide. Arthur's authority was originally rooted in a pact with the natural world, not a divine mandate from a singular god. This connection to the earth becomes even more visceral when we encounter the figure of the Green Knight. In the famous poem, he arrives at Arthur's court as a giant of a man, entirely green, riding a green horse and carrying a massive holly bough. He represents the wild, untamed power of the British wilderness, a force that cannot be conquered by the chivalric codes of the Round Table. When Gawain beheads him, the knight simply picks up his own head and rides away, promising a return match. This is the ancient motif of the Green Man, a fertility symbol found carved into the stonework of hundreds of English churches. He is the personification of the harvest cycle, the grain that must be cut down in the autumn so that it may be reborn in the spring. By placing Arthur's knights in conflict with this figure, the legends are dramatizing the struggle between human civilization and the cyclical, often violent demands of nature. However, as the centuries passed, the story of Arthur underwent a profound and deliberate transformation. This was the work of the scriptorium, where Christian monks labored over vellum pages to reconcile these stubborn pagan memories with the teachings of the Church. This process of sanitization was a cultural necessity. If Arthur was to be the national hero of a Christian England or France, his story had to be scrubbed of its heathen origins. We see this most clearly in the evolution of the Holy Grail. In the oldest Welsh traditions, there was no chalice from the Last Supper. Instead, there was a magical cauldron belonging to the giant Bran the Blessed, a vessel capable of restoring the dead to life or providing an endless feast. It was a symbol of Celtic abundance and the womb of the earth. The medieval church took this pagan cauldron and rebranded it. They replaced the earthy, life-giving pot with the vessel of the Eucharist, shifting the focus from physical survival to spiritual salvation. The quest was no longer about a warrior proving his worth to the spirits of the land. It became a search for a holy relic that could only be achieved through Christian purity. This rebranding created a fascinating cultural tension that remains visible in the text. You can see the monks struggling to explain away the magic. Merlin, once a wild woodsman and shamanic prophet of the Old North, was recast as the son of a demon, his powers rebranded as something dangerous or divinely tolerated. The Round Table, originally a symbol of the warrior's egalitarian bond, was reinterpreted as a representation of the 12 apostles. This was a systematic attempt to colonize the British imagination. The old gods were not killed, they were simply renamed and tucked into the corners of the story as enchantresses or hermits. But the pagan roots proved too deep to be fully extracted. The tension between the old ways and the new faith is what gives the Arthurian legend its haunting, melancholic quality. It is a story about a world in transition, caught between a fading era of spirit-haunted woods and a rising era of structured religion. Even in the most devout versions of the story, the land itself still behaves like a pagan entity. When the king is wounded, the land withers. This is the concept of the wasteland, the belief that the health of the monarch and the fertility of the soil are one and the same. It is a concept that predates Christianity by millennia. It suggests that Arthur is more than a king. He is a sacrificial figure, bound to the geography of Britain in a way that no administrative law could ever replicate. As we analyze these layers, we see that the Arthurian myth did not survive in spite of its pagan origins, but because of them. The monks provided the structure and the morality, but the ancient Celts provided the soul. The resulting story is a magnificent hybrid, a monument to the moment when the ancient mysteries of the island met the organized theology of the continent. The friction between these two worlds created a spark that has never quite gone out. It left us with a hero who stands at the crossroads of history and myth, a king who belongs to the church in his words, but who belongs to the water and the earth in his bones. This transition from the old gods to the new faith was not a clean break, but a long, slow fading, leaving Arthur as a bridge between the world of men and the shadows of a lost, enchanted landscape. If Arthur is a bridge, then he is one that spans more than just two eras of faith. He spans the distance between the finite life of a man and the infinite life of a promise. When we speak of the once and future king, we are moving beyond the borders of historical archaeology and into the deeper, more shadowed territory of the human psyche. This is the moment where the warrior of the 6th century transforms into a messianic archetype, a figure who does not merely die, but waits. This concept of the sleeping hero is not unique to these islands, yet it found its most potent expression in the figure of the High King. It suggests that the tragedy of Camlan was not an ending, but a pause, a temporary retreat into the mist. The persistence of this idea reveals a fundamental truth about how we process the passage of time. To believe in a king who will return is to reject the cold finality of history. We are a species that struggles with the concept of permanent loss. When we see a culture collapse, when we witness the burning of libraries or the fall of cities, there is a desperate, collective need to believe that the best of us is merely hidden, held in reserve for a day of even greater darkness. This is the psychological mechanism of the Golden Age. We look back at Camelot not as a failed political experiment, but as a standard of perfection that we once held and somehow let slip through our fingers. The myth tells us that what was lost is not gone, it is simply waiting for us to become worthy of it again. Consider the image of the king beneath the hill. Across the landscape of Britain, From the hollowed peaks of the Eildon Hills to the silent depths of Alderley Edge, local legends claim that Arthur and his knights lie in a state of suspended animation. They are described as sitting around a stone table, their armor dusty but intact, their swords ready to be drawn at the sound of a horn. This imagery is deeply evocative. It speaks to a desire for a guardian who exists outside the reach of decay. If the king is under the earth, he is part of the land itself. He becomes a personification of the soil, a dormant power that can be called upon when the identity of the people is threatened. This isn't just folklore, it is a form of cultural insurance. It provides a sense of continuity that survives even the most brutal conquests. The cyclic nature of this story mirrors the cycles of the natural world. Just as the winter sun must inevitably return to its zenith, the king must return to his throne. This removes Arthur from the linear timeline of kings and queens and places him in the seasonal time of myth. In this framework, failure is never final. The wound that Arthur suffered at the hands of Mordred is often described as a wound that will not heal, yet it does not kill him. He is taken to Avalon, the Isle of Fruit or the Isle of Glass, a place that exists on the periphery of our vision. This sanctuary serves as a laboratory for restoration. The king's presence there ensures that the ideal of the Round Table remains untainted by the compromises of the physical world. It remains pure because it is unreachable. This collective longing for restoration speaks to the human condition in a way few other stories can.
We live in a world defined by fragmentation and entropy. Our institutions fail, our heroes are revealed to be flawed, and the things we build eventually crumble. Arthur represents the hope that there is a version of our world that is whole, where justice is absolute, and where leadership is synonymous with sacrifice. By projecting this hope into a future return, we allow ourselves to endure the imperfections of the present. We tell ourselves that the darkness is only a season. The promise of the return is a way of saying that the light we once saw was real, and because it was real, it must eventually come back. The philosophical power of the once and future king lies in its invitation to look at history as a spiral rather than a straight line. Every time Britain or the wider world has faced a moment of existential dread, the ghost of Arthur has been summoned. During the darkest days of the world wars, the imagery of the sleeping king was revived to bolster the spirit of a nation under siege. It wasn't because people literally expected a man in plate armor to emerge from a cave, but because the idea of Arthur provides a template for resilience. He is the personification of the belief that our greatest days are not entirely behind us. When we ask why the story is cyclic, we are really asking why we need to believe in second chances. The Arthurian cycle is a narrative loop that offers comfort against the arrow of time. It suggests that even the most devastating betrayal, the collapse of a brotherhood, the loss of a kingdom, is merely part of a larger pattern that will eventually correct itself. Arthur becomes the vessel of our collective grief and our collective hope. He is the guardian of the potential that resides in every generation. Ultimately, the story of Arthur is a story about the refusal to say goodbye. It is a refusal to accept that the sword has been thrown back into the lake for the last time. As the mist settles over the water and the boat disappears toward the horizon of Avalon, we are left standing on the shore, not in mourning, but in anticipation. We are the architects of this legend because we need it to be true. We need to believe that the bridge Arthur built leads not just to a lost landscape of gods, but to a future where the fractured table
is made whole once more. The shadow of Camelot is not a dark thing. It is the long silhouette cast by a sun that is setting, only to rise again. It is the enduring heartbeat of a culture that refuses to let its dreams die, holding fast to the quiet, powerful conviction that the king is not dead, but merely dreaming, waiting for the horn to sound and for the world to be made right. That dream did not remain confined to the yellowed pages of medieval manuscripts or the quiet corners of rural folklore. As the 19th century dawned, a world increasingly defined by the soot and iron of the Industrial Revolution began to look backward with a desperate, romantic longing. The smoke of the factory required an antidote, and it found one in the gleaming armor of a forgotten age. This was the moment the sleeping king finally stirred, not as a warlord of the Dark Ages, but as a moral compass for a new and uncertain empire. It was Alfred Lord Tennyson who truly breathed life back into the legend, transforming the scattered myths into a cohesive moral vision with his Idylls of the King. For the Victorians, Arthur was no longer a distant, dusty figure of history. He became the ultimate gentleman, a symbol of high-minded virtue and restrained passion. Camelot was reimagined as a perfect society that fell not because of external enemies, but because of internal moral failure. The betrayal of Lancelot and Guinevere wasn't just a story of a broken heart. It was a warning about the fragility of civilization itself. This era saw the legend move from the library to the art gallery. The pre-Raphaelite painters obsessed over the Lady of Shalott and the death of Arthur, draping the stories in rich colors and a sense of tragic beauty. They weren't interested in the dirt of the 6th century. They were interested in the mood of the myth, creating a visual language of long hair, reflected mirrors, and shining blades that still defines how we picture the story today. But as the world moved into the 20th century, the shiny surface of Victorian chivalry began to crack under the weight of modern warfare. The horrors of the Great War made the old ideas of glorious battle and knightly virtue feel hollow. The legend had to adapt or die. It was T.H. White who managed to bridge this gap with The Once and Future King. He took the grand tragedy and infused it with a deep, aching humanity. Through the eyes of a young Arthur, or Wart, we saw the education of a king who was taught to think rather than just to fight. White's Arthur was a man who tried to replace the rule of might with the rule of law, a struggle that felt deeply relevant to a generation that had seen the world tear itself apart. This version of the story wasn't just about magic. It was about the heavy burden of leadership and the sad realization that some dreams are too big for the people meant to carry them. When the legend moved to the silver screen, it shifted shape once again to fit the anxieties and aspirations of a global audience. In the middle of the century, Hollywood embraced the spectacle. Films like Knights of the Round Table offered a technicolor vision of the myth, full of bright banners and clean-shaven heroes. But the most significant cultural shift came when the story moved from the screen to the halls of power. The presidency of J.F. Kennedy became synonymous with the word Camelot, a brief, shining moment of idealism that ended in a tragedy that felt mythic in its own right. Suddenly, the story of Arthur wasn't just a piece of literature. It was a shorthand for a lost era of hope. The late 20th century brought a new layer of complexity. If the 50s were about idealism, the decades that followed were about deconstruction. Monty Python and the Holy Grail did something that many thought impossible. It used humor to reinforce the legend's power. By mocking the tropes of the brave knight and the mystical lady in the lake, it showed just how deeply these images were burned into the collective consciousness. You can only satirize something that everyone already knows by heart. Shortly after, John Boorman's Excalibur took the story back into the mud and the mist. It was a visceral, violent, and highly stylized film that treated the legend as a primal, pagan cycle of birth and rebirth. It moved away from the polite tea parties of the Victorians and back towards something older and more dangerous. In the modern era, we see a fascination with stripping away the magic entirely to find the historical core. Films like the 2004 King Arthur or the various gritty television adaptations attempt to place the characters in a realistic Roman or post-Roman setting. They trade the shining plate armor for leather and fur, trying to find the soldier behind the saint. Yet even in these attempts at realism, the mythic elements refuse to be fully silenced. Whether it is a high-octane blockbuster full of digital effects or a quiet, character-driven drama, the core remains the same. The true power of the Arthurian legend is not that it provides a factual record of the past, but that it offers a flexible framework for the present. Every generation gets the Arthur it needs. We have seen him as a medieval conqueror, a Victorian moralist, a post-war pacifist, and a modern action hero. The story survives because it is not fixed in stone like the sword itself. It is a living thing that breathes and changes. The legacy is not found in the ruins of a hill fort or the fragments of an old poem. It lives in the adaptability of the narrative, in its unique ability to hold a mirror up to our own world and show us the kings and villains we are currently trying to become. The king didn't just wake up. He never really went to sleep. He simply waited for us to find a new way to tell his story. That long silence has lasted for 1,500 years, a slow and steady exhale across the rolling hills of Britain. We have looked for him in the broken stones of Tintagel and the deep, dark silt of the Somerset levels, searching for a man who might have bled and breathed in an age defined by smoke and iron. But the man we find at the very beginning of this journey is not wearing a crown of heavy gold or sitting at a table of polished oak. He is a ghost of the borders, a Romano-British commander holding the line against a tide of encroaching darkness that threatened to swallow his world whole. He is a figure defined by the salt of sweat and the cold weight of a Roman blade, a soldier fighting a desperate rearguard action for a civilization that was already slipping through his fingers like dry sand. If we could travel back to those marshy plains and the dense, forgotten forests, we would see a leader who was likely more grit than glory. This original version of the man was born from the hard necessity of survival, a tactical mind forged in the slow-motion collapse of an empire. He was not fighting for a high ideal or a holy cup. He was fighting for one more harvest, one more season of safety, for a people caught in the chaotic space between the old world and the new. Yet even then, the seeds of the legend were being sown in the campfire stories told by his tired men. The memory of a victory at a place called Badon Hill became a beacon, a light that refused to go out even as the moss and the trees reclaimed the ancient Roman roads. As the centuries rolled forward, the mud of the 5th century began to dry, and the voices of the poets began to polish the memory of the man. The rough-edged soldier was slowly clothed in the fine silks of French romance, his heavy iron sword replaced by the shimmering, magical steel of Excalibur. He became the center of a courtly world where honor was the only currency that mattered, and the Round Table offered a glimpse of a perfect, if fleeting, equality among peers. This was not just a change in the fashion of the day, it was a fundamental change in the human spirit and what we required from our heroes. We needed a king who represented our highest aspirations, a leader who could balance the heavy weight of power with the fragile beauty of mercy. The historical warrior may have faded into the earth, but the icon was born in his place, rising from the pages of handwritten manuscripts to become the architect of our collective dreams. When the world grew loud and industrial and cold, we turned back to him once again, finding a strange kind of solace in the mist of Avalon and the tragic grace of his eventual downfall. The generations that came before us saw him as a moral compass for a changing society, while our own age often sees him as a symbol of hope in the face of an inevitable ending. Every generation looks into the glass of this legend and sees its own face staring back, changed by the light of its own time. We see our modern fears of betrayal, our deep longing for justice, and our persistent belief that a better world is possible if only we are brave enough to imagine it. He has become a vast container for everything we hold dear, a vessel for the quiet virtues we struggled to maintain in the noise of our own lives. Perhaps the search for the real king was always destined to lead us back to the people we are today. If we never find his bones resting in the soil, it is only because he does not live in the earth, but in the very breath of the storyteller. He is the quiet wind moving through the ruins of Glastonbury and the long shadow falling across the high peaks of the north. He is the promise that even after the greatest defeat, something essential remains behind. The story we tell is the story of our own refusal to let the light fail when the nights grow long. It is a cycle of rising and falling, of beginnings hidden within endings, and of the quiet strength found in the act of waiting for the right moment to return. As the light fades over the jagged coastlines and the deep green valleys of this ancient landscape, we can finally let the questions rest. The truth of the legend is not found in a specific date or a hidden location, but in the way his name still makes us look toward the far horizon with a sense of wonder. He is the idea that endures long after the stones have crumbled into dust. He is not a person to be found, but a mirror to be held. Arthur is the name we give to our own potential, a shadow that grows longer as the sun sets, reminding us that the greatest kings are those who live forever in the way we choose to treat one another. Sleep now, and let the landscapes of the past blend softly into the dreams of the future. The king remains exactly where he has always been, watching over the silent hills and the silver water. This has been a journey through the shadows of a story that never truly ends. I am your guide, and this is Somnolent.